September 25th, 1944. Midnight. Netherlands. John Idenden drove into total darkness. No headlights. German artillery would find him. No map. The route was classified. No idea where this road actually led. Just orders radioed 30 minutes ago. Proceed north. Pick up survivors. Wait. Survivors. The operation was supposed to end the war by Christmas. Everyone said so. The newspapers, the generals, even Eisenhower believed it. Survivors of what? John gripped the steering wheel of his Dodge truck and drove north. Into the rain, into the unknown, into a darkness that felt wrong. But before I show you what John found on that dark road, and why his truck with 4 flat tires became proof that everything they'd been told was a lie, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because this story, the generals tried to bury it under 2 words, 90% successful. But John Idenden drove the 10% they don't talk about. The 10%, that was the entire point. Let me show you what that looked like. The only Dodge truck in the entire 9th Field Company, Royal Engineers. Everyone knew that vehicle. John was the quartermaster's driver. That meant something in 1944. It meant you were reliable, steady. The kind of man who could keep a 3-ton truck running through Belgium, Holland, and whatever came next. When soldiers saw John's Dodge rolling up, it meant supplies were arriving. Hot food, ammunition, sleeping bags. Hope on wheels. That night, September 25th, the back of John's truck was packed with stores. Sleeping bags folded and ready. Equipment for the advance into Germany, the final push. Victory supplies. Tonight, John would give them to men retreating from Holland. Wrong direction. Wrong war. The first figure emerged from the darkness like a ghost. John slowed the Dodge. The man trudged toward the truck, head down, rain streaming off his helmet. No rifle, no pack, just walking. Then John saw his feet. Socks, over boots. Not beside boots, not instead of boots. Over them, like bandages. Like the leather underneath had worn completely through, and the man had wrapped his feet in whatever he could find. British paratroopers, the elite, the best soldiers in the entire army, walking through their boots. John stopped the truck. The man climbed into the back without speaking, didn't ask where they were going, didn't say what happened, just climbed in and sat down in the darkness. Another figure appeared, then another. John strained to see faces in the darkness. The third man who climbed in, John recognized him. Titch Greenwood. Same company, same unit. Same meals in the mess hall. Same jokes about John's Dodge being the only one in HQ company. Titch looked at John, said nothing, because what do you say? The bridge didn't hold. We lost. They told us relief was coming and it never came. Silence was easier. Titch climbed into the back of the Dodge and sat down among the sleeping bags meant for victory. John counted 7 men total in the first group, maybe 8. Hard to tell in the darkness. All silent, all soaking wet, all defeated. More men appeared out of the rain, some limping, some supporting others, none talking. These were the men who'd jumped out of planes on September the 17th, 8 days ago, to capture a bridge 64 miles behind enemy lines. The newspapers had called them heroes. The propaganda posters showed them landing triumphantly, rifles ready, determination on their faces. Now they had nothing. No rifles, no packs. Some no helmets, some with socks over boots because even the leather had given up. They climbed into John's truck like ghosts boarding a ferry to the underworld. The Dodge sat low on its suspension, heavy with the weight of defeat. John drove them to the collection point near Nijmegen. The men climbed out without speaking, disappeared into the darkness towards shelter. John sat in the driver's seat. Rain drummed on the metal roof. He was exhausted, It was past midnight. He'd driven from Nijmegen to the Rhine and back. An officer appeared at his window. "There are more. Go back." John stared at him. "Go back?" "Yes, now. They're still coming across." That's what broke John. Not the first trip. Not seeing Titch Greenwood with dead eyes. Not the socks over boots. The second trip. Because if they needed him to go back, the defeat wasn't finished. It was still happening. Still ongoing. Still real. The operation that was supposed to end the war by Christmas was ending in a wet, dark evacuation, and John was the driver. John turned the Dodge around, back into the darkness, back toward the Rhine, back toward men who'd held a bridge for 9 days waiting for relief that never came. The radio crackled in his cab, fragments of communication. Someone shouting coordinates. An explosion somewhere in the distance, far enough to be someone else's problem, close enough to remind you it could be yours next. John drove with no lights on. Just the road ahead, or what he assumed was the road. Could be a ditch, could be a minefield, could be anything. He didn't know where he was going, just north, toward the river, toward the survivors. The rain didn't stop, the darkness didn't lift. 3 days ago, September 22nd, Field Marshal Montgomery had stood before reporters and called Operation Market Garden a bold stroke to end the war. The newspapers ran headlines: "British Paratroopers seize bridge deep in Holland." Victory propaganda. The BBC broadcast reports of success. American newspapers picked up the story. Everyone believed it was working. John gripped the steering wheel, listened to rain hammer the metal roof. Thought about Titch Greenwood climbing into his truck without speaking. Thought about socks over boots. This was victory? The propaganda posters hadn't prepared him for this. They'd shown heroic soldiers charging forward. They'd shown grateful Dutch civilians throwing flowers. They hadn't shown silent men with dead eyes climbing into the back of a Dodge truck at midnight because the operation that was supposed to succeed had catastrophically failed. More figures appeared in the darkness. John stopped the Dodge. One man limping badly. Another supporting him. A third walking alone, helmet gone, staring straight ahead at nothing. They climbed into the back without asking questions. What was there to ask? Wet, exhausted, defeated. John heard them moving around in the back. The sleeping bags, meant for the advance into Germany, being pulled out and wrapped around men retreating from Holland. Wrong direction, wrong supplies, wrong war. Someone coughed, a wet, rattling sound. No one spoke. The silence was worse than screaming, screaming you could respond to. Silence just sat there, heavy and permanent. John drove south, away from the Rhine, away from the bridge that didn't hold, away from the operation that was supposed to end the war. His Dodge, the only one in the 9th Field Company, carried maybe 12 men this trip, maybe 15, hard to count in the darkness, all of them silent. The rain continued. John had no idea how many trips other drivers were making, how many men were still crossing the river, how many hadn't made it across at all. The radio crackled with fragments, orders, coordinates, someone asking for confirmation of something John didn't understand. He just drove. That's what you do in war. Someone gives you orders, you follow them. Pick up survivors, drive south, go back, do it again. Don't ask why the survivors exist. Don't ask why the operation failed. Don't ask why you're evacuating from an offensive that was supposed to win the war. Just drive. Second trip complete. The men climbed out at the collection point, disappeared into the darkness toward shelter. John sat in the driver's seat. His hands ached from gripping the wheel. His back hurt from the tension of driving without lights. An officer appeared again. That's it for tonight. Find shelter in Nijmegen. The school, someone called it the pagoda. Get some rest. Tomorrow we're moving the survivors to Brussels for evacuation. Evacuation. There it was. The word no one had said 3 days ago when Montgomery called this a bold stroke. They were evacuating, retreating, the opposite of what was supposed to happen. John drove toward Nijmegen, found the school, parked his Dodge, climbed out. His legs shook when his feet hit the ground. He didn't know if it was exhaustion or something else. Maybe just the weight of understanding. This wasn't a temporary setback. This wasn't a minor adjustment to the plan. This was failure, complete, total, undeniable. And John had driven it twice in total darkness. Tomorrow, they'd tell him to do it again. Because the bold stroke was becoming a rout, and someone had to drive the survivors home. The school stood in central Nijmegen. Someone called it the pagoda. John never learned why. Didn't matter. It had walls, a roof. After driving through darkness twice, that was enough. John and his mate Paddy found a corner. Someone had brought food, sausage and potatoes. They ate quickly, mechanically, still hungry. Paddy looked at John. "Reckon there's more food inside?" They went in. Stone hallways. Classroom doors standing open. The building felt wrong. Occupied but empty. Like everyone had left suddenly. John walked down a corridor, checked a room, nothing. Suddenly, glass. Everywhere. The big stained glass window. Gone. Shattered into 1,000 pieces across the floor. John's ears rang. He couldn't tell if it was a bomb or a shell. Someone shouted, "Incoming!" but the explosion had already happened. 2 men were on the floor. They'd been in the washroom. Washing. Shaving. Just trying to be human for 5 minutes. Trying to scrape away the mud and blood and feel like soldiers instead of animals. Now they were on the floor, badly wounded. John moved without thinking. Grabbed one man under the shoulders. Someone else, maybe Paddy, grabbed the other. They lifted. Carried them toward the entrance. Don't look at the wounds. Just lift. Just carry. Just get them to someone who can help. Nuns appeared. Where from? John didn't know. A nearby building, maybe. A convent. They materialized out of the chaos like angels in white habits. John and Paddy handed the men over. The nuns' hands were steady, professional. They'd done this before. John stepped back. His hands were shaking. The nuns carried the 2 men away. John never learned their names, never found out if they survived. Just 2 men who wanted to shave. 2 men who thought they were safe. 2 men who learned that nowhere was safe. Not even here, miles from the front line, in a school in Nijmegen. Morning came. John walked outside to check his truck. Stopped. 4 flat tires, all 4. He walked around the Dodge slowly. The canvas canopy, shredded, like someone had taken scissors to it. Dozens of holes, some small, some large enough to fit a fist through. Every hole was a fragment. Every tear was a piece of shrapnel from the same explosion that had hit the school. The only Dodge in the 9th Field Company. Now it looked like the men John had picked up last night, damaged but not destroyed. An officer walked over, inspected the truck. "Can it drive?" John checked. The engine turned over, the steering worked, the brakes held. "Yes, sir." "Good, load up. We're moving the survivors to Brussels. They're flying back to England." 4 flat tires. Canopy in shreds, but it still ran. That's war. That's the arithmetic of it. Damaged isn't the same as destroyed, so you keep going. The survivors appeared from various shelters around Nijmegen. They looked worse in daylight. Mud-caked uniforms, hollow eyes, faces that hadn't slept in days. Some still had the socks over boots. Others had found new boots, taken from dead Germans, though no one said that out loud. They climbed into John's Dodge through the holes in the canvas. Through the shredded canopy, they could see sky. Rain still falling, grey clouds. No one commented on the damaged truck. Why would they? They were damaged too. 30 men, maybe, packed into the back. sitting on the sleeping bags that were meant for victory. John started the engine. The Dodge lurched forward on 4 flat tires. The ride was rough, bone-jarring, every bump transmitted directly through the metal frame. No one complained, they just sat there, silent. They stopped in Louvain for the first night. John and Paddy looked at each other, same thought. They borrowed a jeep, drove to Meerbeek, a small village in the vicinity of Brussels and Louvain. Before the push north, before Operation Market Garden, before everything went wrong, John's unit had stayed here briefly. The Desmet family, 2 young daughters, Marcella and Melanie. John and Paddy had become friendly with them. The girls had been excited about liberation, about the British soldiers who came to free them from the Germans. The war was over, they thought. The British were here. Everything would be fine now. John knocked on the door. Madame Desmet opened it. Her face lit up for a moment, then fell. She saw something in John's expression. "You're leaving?" Not a question, a statement. "Yes." Marcella appeared behind her mother, 9 years old, eyes bright with the kind of hope only children have. "You're leaving, but you just came." John had no answer. Because she was right. They'd promised liberation, delivered it, celebrated it. The girls had laughed, the family had shared what little food they had, and now John was driving survivors backward, away from Germany, away from victory. "I'm sorry," John said. What else could he say? That the operation failed, that the bridge didn't hold, that men died for nothing. "You don't tell that to a 9-year-old girl." Madame Desmet nodded. She understood what John couldn't say. "Be safe," she said. They said goodbye. John and Paddy drove back to Louvain in silence. Tomorrow. Next day, Brussels airfield. The survivors climbed out of John's Dodge, formed into lines. Officers checked names against lists. Planes waited on the tarmac, from Holland to Belgium to England, backward, the wrong direction. They were supposed to be advancing into Germany by now, supposed to be ending the war, supposed to be heroes returning triumphant, instead evacuating, flying home defeated. John watched them board the planes. Titch Greenwood was in one of the groups. He glanced at John as he walked past, still didn't speak. What was there to say? The planes took off one by one, engines roaring, rising into grey sky. John stood next to his Dodge. 4 flat tires. Canvas canopy shredded, paint scratched from tree branches in Holland. Still running, still carrying, still damaged. An officer walked over. "Return to your unit. We're pulling back to Ostend in a few days, loading everything onto ferries, going back to England." Back to England. The operation that was supposed to end the war by Christmas was ending in October, in retreat, in evacuation, in silence. John climbed into the driver's seat of his Dodge, started the engine. The truck lurched forward on 4 flat tires. And John drove away from Brussels airfield, where men flew backward toward home, away from the victory that never came. October 1944. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before reporters in Brussels. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes. The war correspondents waited for the official statement about Operation Market Garden. Everyone knew it had failed. The question was, how would Montgomery spin it? He cleared his throat. Operation Market Garden was 90% successful. 90%. John Iddenden heard this on the radio 2 days later. He looked at his Dodge truck. 4 flat tires. Canvas canopy shredded like paper. This was 90% successful. Montgomery's math worked like this. Eindhoven Bridge, captured. Nijmegen Bridge, captured. Arnhem Bridge, failed. 2 out of 3 equals 66%. He said 90. But that wasn't the real problem with the math. The real problem was this. Arnhem was the objective. The entire objective, the only objective that mattered. Eindhoven and Nijmegen weren't destinations. They were the road to Arnhem. The approach, the way to get there. Without Arnhem, the other two bridges were just bridges to nowhere. It's like building 90% of a bridge across a river. You have the approaches on both sides. The support pillars, most of the span. But that last 10%, the part in the middle connecting the two sides, missing. You can't drive across 90% of a bridge. You drown. That's what happened at Arnhem. They built the approach, got close, almost made it, then drowned. And Montgomery called it 90% successful. John thought about the men in his truck. Titch Greenwood, who didn't speak. The man with socks over boots. The ones who'd held the north end of Arnhem Bridge for 9 days waiting for relief. Relief that never came. Because the Nijmegen Bridge, the approach to Arnhem, took 4 days to capture instead of 1. 4 days of delay. 4 days of British paratroopers dying at Arnhem. 4 days of waiting. And when the relief finally reached Nijmegen, they couldn't get to Arnhem anyway because German forces had cut the road. The plan fell apart, but Montgomery said 90% successful. The intelligence had been clear. Dutch resistance warned them. 2 SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. Refitting. Rearming. Right there. British intelligence officers presented the evidence. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed German tanks in the area. Montgomery's staff studied the reports, then ignored them. Why? Because admitting the intelligence was correct meant cancelling the operation. And Montgomery wanted this operation, needed it. His rivalry with American General Patton demanded it. His reputation required it. The newspapers expected it. So the intelligence got dismissed. Those tanks are probably not operational. The photos are inconclusive. The Dutch resistance is exaggerating. Every excuse in the military handbook. General Browning, Montgomery's deputy, asked the question everyone was thinking. Sir, can we do this? Montgomery replied, we're going to do this. Notice the difference. Can we versus we're going to. One question asks about capability. The other announces decision. Reality versus belief. Truth versus propaganda. And when reality and belief collided at Arnhem, reality won. It always does. The cost of Montgomery's certainty, 1,984 British paratroopers killed, 6,854 captured. For a bridge they held for 4 days, then lost. John had driven maybe 40 men total, 2 trips in darkness. Maybe more trips happened that he didn't know about. But the math was brutal. 8,000 men went to Arnhem, 2,000 came back. That's not 90% successful. That's 75% casualty rate, the largest British airborne defeat of the war. And Montgomery stood before reporters and cameras and journalists and said 90% successful. John understood something in that moment. This is how propaganda works. You focus on what went right. Emphasize the victories. Celebrate the bridges captured. Eindhoven. Success. Nijmegen. Success. See, 2 successes. That's good news. Then you mention Arnhem quietly, briefly, as a minor setback. The Northern Bridge objective was not achieved. Clinical language, passive voice, no emotion. You bury the casualties in statistics, round the numbers, make them abstract. Approximately 2,000 casualties. Approximately. As if precision would make it worse. And you control the narrative. 90% successful. Say it enough times, people believe it. The newspapers print it. The radio broadcasts it. The history books record it. 90% successful. But John drove the 10% that failed, twice, in total darkness. And his truck, riddled with holes, running on 4 flat tires, was physical proof. Evidence that couldn't be spun. The propaganda posters had promised glory. They showed heroic soldiers charging forward, rifles raised, determination on their faces, victory certain. They didn't show men with socks over boots. They didn't show Titch Greenwood's Teelance. They didn't show the two men in the Nijmegen school who just wanted to shave. They didn't show John's Dodge truck, the only one in the 9th Field Company, sitting on 4 flat tires with its canopy shredded. Because that's not propaganda, that's reality. And reality doesn't sell war bonds. Reality doesn't inspire enlistment. Reality doesn't win press conferences. So you call it 90% successful and move on. The newspapers bought it. Headlines in London: Market Garden achieves objectives. Subheadings: minor setback at Northern Bridge. The articles focused on the bridges captured, the ground gained, the German forces engaged, victory framing. A few papers mentioned the casualties, buried on page 3, so in the small paragraphs. British forces withdrew from Arnhem after fierce fighting. Withdrew. Not defeated, not evacuated, not rescued in the middle of the night by drivers like John, who drove without lights through rain and darkness. Withdrew. As if it was planned, as if it was orderly, as if men hadn't died, waiting for relief that never came. John sat in his Dodge. After hearing Montgomery's statement, he looked at the dashboard, the steering wheel, the shattered windscreen he'd been meaning to report, 4 flat tires beneath him, canvas canopy above him torn to shreds, sleeping bags in the back, meant for Germany, given to retreat. This truck was witness, physical evidence. You can't lie to a truck. The holes don't care about propaganda. The flat tires don't respond to spin. The shredded canvas doesn't believe press conferences. The truck knew what happened. It carried the truth in its frame. Every dent, every tear, every piece of shrapnel embedded in metal. And John, hands on the steering wheel, understood something fundamental about war. The men at the top control the narrative. The men at the bottom carry the evidence. And the evidence is always heavier. Montgomery would go on to write memoirs. He'd defend Market Garden for decades. He'd argue it was worth attempting, that it achieved strategic objectives, that the criticism was unfair. He'd spend the rest of his life justifying 90%. But he never drove to the Rhine at midnight, never picked up men with socks over boots, never carried Titch Greenwood in silence, never watched 2 men get blown across a room while shaving, never handed in a Dodge truck with 4 flat tires and a shredded canopy and watched it get scrapped without ceremony. Montgomery controlled the words. John carried the weight. That's the difference between propaganda and truth. One lives in press conferences. The other lives in the back of a damaged Dodge truck, driving through darkness toward men who held a bridge that didn't matter because the operation that was supposed to end the war, instead, just ended them. 90% successful. John started his engine. The Dodge lurched forward on flat tires, and John drove toward Ostend, where they'd load everything onto ferries and sail back to England, back to the place they'd left months ago, believing they were going to win. Now, returning with the knowledge that sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. Because the plan was wrong, because the intelligence was ignored, because someone decided belief mattered more than reality. And reality, as always, had the final word. Beginning of October, Ostend Port. John drove his Dodge onto the ferry. The ramp clanged under 4 flat tires, metal on metal, the sound of retreat. Other trucks followed. Tanks, equipment, everything they'd brought to Holland, everything except the men who didn't come back. The ferry pushed away from the dock. John stood on deck watching Belgium disappear into the distance. Somewhere back there, Meerbeek, the Desmet family. Marcella asking why they were leaving. Somewhere farther, Holland, the Rhine, Arnhem Bridge, somewhere in the darkness. Men still missing. still unaccounted for. The ferry cut through grey water, England ahead, victory behind, wrong direction, Lincolnshire. 3 days later, John drove the Dodge to a depot outside town. Military vehicles lined up in rows, hundreds of them, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, all waiting for inspection, all waiting for judgment. An officer with a clipboard approached, walked around John's truck slowly, counted the holes in the canvas canopy, examined the flat tyres, ran his hand along the scratched paint where tree branches in Holland had scraped the metal, wrote something on his clipboard. Scrapped. One word. John stood there. Scrapped? Yes. Too damaged for repair. We'll allocate you a replacement. The officer moved to the next vehicle. That was it. No ceremony, no recognition. No, thank you for driving through darkness twice to evacuate men from the operation that was 90% successful. Just scrapped next. John looked at his Dodge, the only one in the 9th Field Company, the truck everyone knew, the one that carried supplies forward, hope forward, victory forward, then carried defeat backward. It sat there on 4 flat tyres, canvas canopy torn, windscreen cracked, paint scratched and dented, but still running. The engine still turned over, the steering still worked, the brakes still held, damaged but not destroyed, just like the men John had carried. But damaged was enough. In the Army's mathematics, damaged equals scrapped. You don't repair, you replace. Cheaper, faster, simpler. Metal is replaceable. They gave John a new truck 2 days later. Bedford, 3-ton, standard issue, clean, intact, no holes, no scratches, no history. Fresh paint, inflated tyres, canvas canopy, perfect and whole, ready for the next operation. An officer handed John the keys. Sign here. John signed. The officer walked away. John stood looking at the new Bedford. It was better than the Dodge in every measurable way. Newer, undamaged, reliable. But it wasn't the Dodge. It hadn't driven to the Rhine at midnight, hadn't carried Titch Greenwood in silence, hadn't evacuated men with socks over boots, hadn't sat outside the Nijmegen school when the bomb hit. This truck was clean, innocent. It knew nothing. John thought about Harvey Smith, another driver he'd heard about. Harvey carried German shrapnel in his body for 47 years, embedded too deep to remove. A permanent souvenir of war. John's Dodge lasted 5 months. Some wars stay inside you. Some get scrapped in Lincolnshire. Some wounds are metal fragments in flesh. Some are memories, all permanent, even after the evidence disappears. The Dodge went to a scrapyard somewhere. John never learned where. They probably melted it down, turned the metal into something else. Another truck, ammunition, bed frames, raw material, the holes from shrapnel, the flat tyres from the Nijmegen bombing, the scratches from Dutch tree branches, all melted away. Evidence destroyed. Only the paperwork remained. Vehicle scrapped due to excessive damage sustained during operations. Clinical language. No mention of where, no mention of why, no mention of the men it carried, or the darkness it drove through, or the truth it witnessed. Just excessive damage. As if it was the truck's fault. Montgomery kept saying 90% successful. The newspapers kept printing it. The official histories would record it. And somewhere in a Lincolnshire scrapyard, the only evidence that contradicted the official narrative got melted down into raw steel. Convenient. John climbed into his new Bedford, started the engine. It ran smoothly. No grinding, no hesitation. Perfect. He drove it back to his unit, parked it next to the other trucks, all identical, All Bedford, all replaceable. No one mentioned the Dodge. Why would they? War moves forward. You don't look back at scrapped equipment. You don't mourn trucks. You just sign for the new one and continue. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked. But John remembered, driving in total darkness. No lights, no map. Titch Greenwood's face in the rain, socks over boots, the silence, the weight of men who'd been promised relief that never came, the smell of wet uniforms and defeat. The Nijmegen school explosion, glass everywhere, 2 men on the floor who just wanted to shave, 4 flat tires in the morning, canvas shredded like paper, sleeping bags meant for Germany, wrapped around men retreating from Holland, Marcella asking why they were leaving, Brussels airfield, planes flying backward, wrong direction. Montgomery on the radio, 90% successful. And the Dodge truck, witness to all of it, scrapped without ceremony. The propaganda had promised glory. The newspapers had promised victory. Montgomery had promised a bold stroke to end the war. They delivered retreat, evacuation, defeat, wrapped in the language of success, 90%. But the 10% that failed was the entire point. And John Idenden drove them home. Years later, decades later, John would tell this story. Not often, not to many people. The war doesn't leave you. It just becomes part of you. Quiet, buried, like shrapnel too deep to remove. Most days you don't think about it. Then something triggers the memory. A truck backfiring, rain on a metal roof, darkness. And suddenly you're back there. September 25th, 1944, driving north into total darkness. No headlights, no map, no idea where you're going. Just orders, pick up survivors. And the question that never got answered, survivors of what? Of an operation that was supposed to end the war? Of a plan that ignored intelligence? Of a bridge too far? Of propaganda that promised one thing and delivered another? Somewhere in Lincolnshire. October 1944. A Dodge truck sat in a scrapyard. The only one in the 9th Field Company. 4 flat tires. Canvas canopy shredded, paint scratched from Dutch branches. It had carried hope north to Holland. It had evacuated defeat south to Belgium. Now it waited for the furnace. The metal didn't remember, but metal doesn't need to. That's what men are for. To carry what the metal can't. To remember what the propaganda erases. To know that 90% successful means 10% died. And 10% is everything when you're the one driving through darkness to pick them up. John Idenden started his new Bedford. Clean, undamaged, perfect. Ready for the next operation. The war continued. The Dodge disappeared. The truth got scrapped. But the memory remained. 4 flat tires don't lie. Even after they're melted down. Even after the evidence is destroyed. Even after the official history says 90% successful. The truth lives in the details they tried to erase. In socks over boots. In Titch Greenwood's chumulence. In sleeping bags given to the wrong men in the wrong direction. In a Dodge truck that told the truth for 5 months before they scrapped it. Some victories aren't measured in bridges captured. Some are measured in men brought home. Through darkness, without lights, without knowing where you're going. Just going, because someone has to drive the 10%. Someone has to carry the evidence. Someone has to remember, even after the truck is gone.